We're going to be designing a very beautiful wreath today, and it's not going to be a seasonal wreath, which means that anything we add to this is not going to be holiday based. It's all going to be very generic material within the color palette of white, green, cream, and we're also going to tie in a little bit of this brown. But notice that the sign is approximately 20 inches long. These signs are a little bit large for wreaths, but often as designers we come across either really small signs or really large signs that we really like that we can't really think of a use for. So I'm going to show you guys how to incorporate this in a 24-inch evergreen base today. So if you ever find a small sign that is a little too small for a general sized wreath, or a sign that's little too large for an average sized wreath as well, if you get them at a reduced cost or a great price, feel free to pick them up. We have taught in the past how to use smaller signs, but today we're going to be using this large and bulky sign. This came from Hobby Lobby. I was there last week and they had some in stock. You can pick these up in their year-round section. You can pick these up in their seasonal department. They often carry similar signs in different variations, but it's just a nice wooden plaque and it has stainless steel in the front that says blessed. It was $17.99. This came from the spring collection. You can pick it up using your 40% off coupon right now, or wait till it goes 50% off in the year-round aisle. It might not be the exact sign, but you definitely can pick up one similar. Notice that it's more than a 1/4 inch thick, which means our arrow staple gun will have no problem using this, and it's not going to go through the front of the sign. So we're going to use our staple gun, 1/4 inch staples, and we're going to use some pipe cleaners. And again, we're going to be attaching this to a 24-inch evergreen base. So to attach them, we're just going to use our staple gun. This one has 2 anchor points, but often you will find it coming with a string or a piece of jute or wire to attach it to a wall. Often these are used for a wall. I always leave them on just for in case my customer decides they don't want the sign or they want to swap it out. That way they can use the sign elsewhere. So we're using 2 staples. We're taking our pipe cleaner, folding it roughly in half, and we're placing it roughly in each corner. And again, no worry of it going through the front of the sign. This is a lot thicker than a 1/4 inch. And it's relatively lightweight. It's not extremely heavy for the size and the material we're using. So we're going to attach this to a 24-inch evergreen base. This wreath we already pre-fluffed, and what I mean by that is I took each and every single branch and I pulled it forward. Notice that it's not as perfect as we typically do. Reason being, we are going to add mesh and different elements to it, so the pine is not going to be as significant, but we do want to make sure we start with a nice base. So we're going to attach it in the middle. As you can see, it is a little bit large for this wreath, but once we finish everything, it will be the perfect size. So we're going to lightly place these wires, and then once we hang it up, if we want to adjust it a little bit, we certainly can. So we were just twisting it a couple times at this point. So now that we have our sign in place, we're going to place it on my easel and we'll begin adjusting it and adding some mesh. Now we're going to begin cutting into our mesh, and we're using poly jute mesh, and as the name suggests, it is containing both poly jute as well as a plastic mesh. And whenever you're designing wreaths like this, you always want to make sure you're dealing with both the plastic and the burlap kind. They also carry standard burlap, which is just your basic burlap, in 10-inch form, 21-inch form. You know, it's the same lengths as typical mesh, but it won't have the rigidity that the plastic has. I know you guys have seen my other burlap wreaths, which is using approximately 5-inch squares that we do the ruffle technique to. That's completely different. It's such a small piece of burlap that it holds its shape, but using anything larger on a design like we're creating today just won't hold up. So always make sure you get mesh, poly jute mesh containing polypropylene, which is the plastic, which, you know, holds up very nicely in the weather. So that's just a little suggestion. We're using this mesh that came from Craft Outlet. It's a 10.5 inch by 10 yard roll, and the item number for this is RY800348, and it has both the natural look as well as the white and stripes. So we're cutting these pieces the full length of my cutting mat, so approximately 18 inches. And the reason we're cutting them so long is that we don't want them to be see-through. Poly jute mesh typically isn't very see-through. You know, it is a nice quality once you add it to your wreath, but we do want to make sure that we get good coverage. So I say start off with about 1/4 of a roll, start adding it. You know, I can't give you an exact number because as you create each wreath, you will notice some takes more, some takes less. It truly depends on the wreath. Same goes with any mesh wreath, any burlap wreath that we have created in the past. It truly depends. Even though we're using the same exact materials and the same exact size wreath, sometimes you have more bare spots, sometimes you put a little bit closer. So just keep that in mind. So go throughout and cut about 1/4 of the roll. And if you have small pieces like this, you know, instead of throwing them away, we can use them in another project or add them in a spot that's a little bit bare. So go throughout and use about 1/4 of a roll, see where it gets you, and then if you need more, you can cut as you need. But I don't like to have a bunch of pieces lying around, so keep that in mind. You could also be using other styles. You could be using solid poly jute burlap, which is just the natural state. You could be using one with white or ivory. They have all sorts of colors. This is one that came from a kit from Trendy Tree that we created a swag with, and we're going to be creating a lantern swag today. Probably before this video posts, it'll be uploaded, but it is a very high quality poly jute mesh. It has the tinsel strands going throughout, so feel free to use whatever one you want to use. If you're trying to match it to your flowers or ribbon, of course match it accordingly. But let's get to adding some of this burlap to our wreath. So here we have our wreath with our sign attached, and as you can see, this sign is a lot larger than what you would typically use on a 24-inch evergreen base. But we're going to use our mesh to our benefit. We're going to extend our wreath a little bit to enlarge it and make it as though the sign is a perfect fit for this wreath. And in doing so, we're going to be creating the base using our ruffle technique. So we're going to create little bow ties using the mesh just by scrunching it up. I will have a close-up video showing you guys that are new exactly what that means. But we're going to create these, and we're going to be placing them around the perimeter to start, and then we'll come back in and fill in the center a little bit. So by using a larger sign, you do reduce the cost in as how much mesh you use, as well as florals and foliage, just simply for the fact that the sign covers the majority of the wreath. You know, we still have about 1/3 here, 1/3 here. You know, it's covering about 1/3 of the wreath. So that is a part of the wreath that we don't have to decorate, which ultimately saves us money. So let me zoom in a little bit to show you guys exactly what I'm doing. I'm not using any twist ties. I'm using solely the pine tips on the wreath. I'm twisting them around the mesh. So I'm gathering one behind, one in front, and I'm just twisting it several times, making sure it's secure. But as you can see, just by incorporating 2 pieces around that, it fills in the wreath, it makes it a little bit larger, and it makes it as though the sign is a perfect fit. By using striped mesh like this, you can follow the pattern, the central portion, which happens to be the plain burlap in this case, all the way up and down to create the perfect ruffle. We're spacing these about 3 inches or so. We're keeping them relatively close because we don't want our wreath to look clumpy and pieces of mesh sticking out every, 6 or 7 inches. So by keeping it tight like that and working it in, it creates a uniform look. Like I said before, we're just starting with the perimeter. We'll come back in and fill in a little bit later. But by adding the mesh in this way, you're extending the wreath about 3 or 4 inches on either side. And like I've always said, by making your wreath larger, you can charge more money for it. And not using any more materials than we would if we were using a different technique. If we were adding ruffles to the entire wreath, we'll still be using the same amount of materials, if not more, for a smaller wreath. So far we've used about 8 or 9 pieces of this mesh, and I already have more than half of it covered. So we'll add one more piece right here. And we are twisting them several times, making sure they are secure. We don't want these pieces coming loose. So this is what we have so far. Just by adding it to the perimeter, now the sign fits nicely into our wreath. But now we're going to come back in and add a few more additional pieces of mesh to hide some of this pine and blend the wreath together. So we'll start at the top, and we'll be doing the same technique. But keep in mind, as you get closer to the sign, you don't really want to cover the sign too much. And since the sign is just placed on the surface, and the mesh is a lot, taller than the sign, we're going to want to make sure we take this mesh and place it as close to the base as possible. And what I mean by that is push it as far down as you can. That way it's not protruding too much in front of the sign, but still gives that same ruffle technique. So we'll be adding a couple of these. So focus on getting it as far down as you can. That way it's not looking too awkward with the sign. So that's what we have up top. Now it looks completely filled in by adding 2 pieces. Now we're going to do the lower half. And we should be able to get by using just 2 pieces for the bottom half as well. But as I said earlier, even though we have the same surface area here as we did up top, every time we add a piece of mesh, it's different. Sometimes we need more, sometimes we need less. We'll just get that out of our way for a second. And we'll take a second piece and place it right here. Again, as far down as you can. So now that we have this mesh in place, we still have a few bare spots where the pine's showing. That's perfectly acceptable, but we do want to add a different flair to this, and we're going to be adding a little bit more of this mesh, but just in a different technique. So now what we're going to do is a different technique that we haven't done in the group necessarily. It's called the curl and ruffle technique. So as you can see, we've already added ruffles throughout the wreath, but now we're going to come back in and add a little dimension using the same exact mesh. If you wanted to use a different mesh, by all means, to contrast, that would be very nice. But to keep it basic, we're going to use the same mesh. And what we're doing is we're just rolling it in a tube, pinching it in the center, and we're going to be placing these throughout the wreath. So as you near the end of a roll, what you'll notice is that the mesh naturally wants to curl up. So just work with it. Don't work against it. Always work with the grain or else you'll have trouble. So just roll it on itself just like this until you create a curl. And in the next little piece when we add, I will show you guys what not to do, which is what I call the cannoli effect. Often when you're trying this method out for the first time, you often end up with some cannolis. That is something we don't want happening, so keep that in mind. But by adding a few of those throughout the wreath, it kind of creates an interesting texture. You can't really see it with the piece that we just added, but in the next piece we'll be able to see. So often when you're just starting out with this technique, you'll roll it a little off, and what happens is you create open weaves, so on either end you'll have some raw edges showing, and it kind of is in the shape of a cannoli depending on how you lay it out. You never really want your raw edges showing. In fresh floristry, that's a big no-no. You don't want your raw wires showing, and the same case for artificial designing like this. You always want to cover your mechanics, or else it'll begin to fray. So just roll it perfectly even. If you can't get it perfectly even on the top or the bottom, just kind of compress it a little bit. Make sure you don't have too much showing. A little bit is okay, but if you have more than half an inch or so, that is not a good idea. So we're going to come back in, place another one. We're just going to be adding a few here and there. And by having different texture like that, it creates an interesting wreath. And what this will do is kind of create the sign as our focal point. So when you add these, it's going to create essentially a V, because when you pinch it in half and you push the two ends out, they'll be facing away from the wreath, and you're going to do that throughout the entire design. And what that will do is kind of create essentially a sunflower. And what I mean by that is all of the petals will be shooting out. So in lieu of petals, we're going to be using the mesh and having them poke out like that. Again, we're not going to be using too many. We place 3 up top. We'll add a couple more around the entire wreath. But if you really want a drastic change, definitely be using different mesh rather than the first one that we added. But I like the simplicity of using the same mesh. So that's a more showy example of what we're trying to achieve. As you can see, we have one right here, and then we have one also up there. So we'll be adding some throughout. I figure about 6 or 7 pieces should do the trick. We place 3 up top, we place 1 on either side. As many as you'd like. Also with these, you really want to push them as far in as possible. That way you get that nice V effect. If you place it just at the surface, what ends up happening is it doesn't really create that nice V, which kind of shoots from either end. So let me zoom down a little bit. Place another one right here. Again, the further deeper close to the center of the wreath you add it, the more likely you're going to see that V. Here we have a little one. This one was the end of that roll from the first roll. And you'll be able to see some of the tubes from around the side. You always want your wreaths to be beautiful from all points of view, and by having these around the perimeter, when your guests walk up, they'll be able to see some of the tubes. So we'll place one more in the lower right-hand corner. And if you are placing these on top of the existing mesh, always make sure you unfold the pine tips. That way it's not placed just on the surface. So there we go. That's the effect you get by incorporating just a handful of the curl method, but it really creates an interesting wreath combining both of the methods, and I really like the look of it using the same exact mesh. Of course, you could use a nice mesh that matches. You could be using this one from the Trendy Tree kit. Now that we finished adding all of our mesh, now we can begin adding some foliage. And the foliage we're going to use today, one of the few, is lamb's ear. This is a very pretty velvety texture. If you've ever felt lamb's ear, it's one of the coolest plants. Same with Dusty Miller, just for the fact that they have such a velvety texture. And it also has that nice blue color, which I love for spring. Dusty Miller and lamb's ear scream spring to me. So we're going to use some of this. I already broke down one of the sprays. This came from Hobby Lobby in their year-round section, so they carry it all year long. And it was $5.99, 50% off, and the item number is 1084359. So we broke it down into individual pieces. We cut them rather small. We don't want to add too much bulk to it, but we do want to bring out a lot of this color. So to evenly distribute it throughout the design, we did break them into smaller segments. We may need an additional pick, but we're going to start with one. So we'll start up here first. So to attach these, we're just using our hot glue. We're adding a generous amount, and we'll begin adding some of them into the design, finding good points that we can anchor them in. So this is one of our thicker foliages, so we can distribute this a lot more spacious than the finer foliage that we're going to be adding a little bit later. This is just to add some texture, some color, without overdoing it. We don't want to completely cover our wreath using this material because it is costly and it'll just create a very congested wreath, which is exactly what we don't want. So we will come back in with a finer texture. So this is the amount of coverage we got from one pick. We got about half the wreath done. And as you can see, we distributed it very evenly, but we were conscious of how spread apart we placed it. So as you can see, each piece is about 4 or 5 inches apart. If you want to add more, you could space it 2 to 3 inches apart, but just make sure you're not going to place it too close that your entire wreath is covered in this lamb's ear. It'll be beautiful, but it'll also be costly, and the congestiveness of it, the very close pieces, using such a broad foliage, will kind of look more for fall and Christmas rather than spring, which is a lot more light and airy. So we're going to break down a second pick, and we'll be placing that on the lower half of the wreath. Now we'll be adding some more lamb's ear on the lower half section of the wreath. So we just broke down another pick, and we'll be peppering some of these in. Keep in mind, like I said earlier, this is just used as a bulk material, add some color, add some drama, but it's not going to be your main greenery. You can if you'd like to. I just think it'd look a little heavy on a spring wreath. Because like I said before, this wreath can be used year-round, but since we're entering spring, we do really want to bring out the spring design. That way it sells for spring, and if it doesn't sell for spring, we're using a very generic base that we can add some flowers that are more seasonal to our design and market it for that specific season. And notice I'm also not following that exact pattern of keeping everything in the same formation. We're placing these the same way the mesh is going. So use your pieces of the tubular mesh as your guide. So place all of your pieces of greenery facing away from your wreath. So having them all face around the perimeter really creates a unique look. And at least that is universal throughout the entire wreath. And what I mean by that is that everything is going to be facing the same way. It's just facing away from the central portion, which is the sign in this case. So we have one more little piece left, and we'll place that in the left-hand corner. Just like that. So this is what our wreath looks like after we add our lamb's ear. Now we're going to be adding a different, finer foliage. So now we're actually going to take a step back, and rather than incorporate our next foliage, which is a little bit finer, we're going to add some of our florals. Reason being, we already have so much going on that we don't want to completely cover everything in expensive greenery and then not be able to see it. So by having this added first, you won't be hiding it once you add your florals because you already know where it is. So just keep these pieces in mind, and you're not going to want to cover them too much. But let's get some ranunculus in. And the neat thing about ranunculus is that in the wedding industry right now, these are extremely popular, but also rather costly, and they don't hold up all that well. Dealing with silks, that is not the case. They are the same price as any other floral from Hobby Lobby, if not even cheaper for the amount you're getting, and they hold up. But anything in the wedding industry right now, you can apply to artificial designing. If it's popular for brides, it'll be popular within this industry as well. So we're going to break these down into smaller segments, and we'll also use some of this foliage, which also has that silvery look and texture throughout. So when we break these down, rather than cutting them at the base like we would for a grapevine wreath, we're going to cut them about 3 or 4 inches down, right under the last set of leaves, which are right under the florals, and then that way we have a couple clusters of leaves that we can place in as a filler greenery later on, rather than using more expensive high-end greenery. So I already broke down some of them. They have that nice soft pink color, almost a coral, which is the 2019 color of the year for a Pantone. But the item number for this is 476853. They were $9.99, 50% off in the year-round section at Hobby Lobby. So far the lamb's ear came from Hobby Lobby in their year-round section, as well as the ranunculus, which means you can make this wreath year-round. Nothing is seasonal besides the evergreen form, which I recommend you guys stock up on while they're on sale now. That way you can use them throughout the year. So to attach these, we're going to be doing the same technique, adding some hot glue and then placing them close to the wreath. We're going to be incorporating these the same way we did the lamb's ear, rather than working them in the same motion as we would with a grapevine floral wreath. Since we're using mesh and such a large bulky sign, that rule doesn't apply necessarily. But by having that soft pink, almost coral, against the blue, it really creates a stunning look. Which I know this isn't a wedding wreath, but these are certainly wedding colors. Everybody loves these, especially for spring. And it's not going to take too much. So when we are peppering these in, we are spacing them out significantly. Same rule applies to the lamb's ear, about every 4 or 5 inches. We don't want to cover all of our mesh. We want to accent our mesh. And this is what the little cluster of leaves will look like. This came from an older wreath that fell off, or I picked it off, or maybe we broke down that wreath. But so it has a steel pick. And I get this question asked a lot by some of our group members, if they recommend using steel picks for an evergreen form, and the answer is simply no. I don't recommend that whatsoever. If anything, I'm against that for safety reasons and for price reasons. You know, when you're adding a steel pick to every stem, it adds up, and you know, you'll have to do a lot more cleanup later on the back of the wreath, because the steel pick is not attaching to anything. It's essentially just floating in air. So if your stems are ever too short for evergreen wreaths, which they really shouldn't be if you put everything a certain way, but if they ever are too short, I recommend you guys add an artificial stem by using some floral tape and a scrap stem from all of your floral picks. rather than at a steel pick. Steel pick I only recommend for any wreath using styrofoam or any wreath using grapevine. That's it. Other than that, I would not recommend it. So we're cutting a few more. And as I've said in the past, just because you're using more florals does not mean your wreath will be more beautiful. If anything, it can kind of get detrimental simply because your whole wreath will be covered in florals, essentially creating a Biedermeier effect where your florals are touching. But by spacing them out, you get the same exact effect, if not more beautiful, and you use significantly less product. But don't forget to place some florals behind your wreath, because you do want your wreath to be beautiful from all points of view. So we're about halfway done, and this is the effect we've gotten so far by using about half the bush. So we're going to cut down the rest of the bush and begin placing it in the lower half of the wreath. But if anything's to be taken from this design so far, it is less is more. If you see any of the pine you don't like, we can cover that up using some of the ranunculus foliage, or come back in later with a finer foliage. But by using less, so far we've gotten a grand effect, but it's not using nearly as many florals as it would if we were compacting them and not using the mesh. So now we're going to come back in and fill the lower half of the wreath with some more ranunculus. Early in their video, I did say we were going to use, plain whites, some greens, some browns, but once we found a lamb's ear, I thought the pink matches it beautifully. If you ever have trouble picking colors, I did create a blog post on nickseasonaldecor.com talking about how I pick colors and how I necessarily match them to be. I am going to have a more in-depth post talking about that strictly for the group a little bit later on. But if it looks good to you and you think it'll sell, by all means start putting them together, pick your colors wisely. And if you ever have trouble, use a color chart. But by using the pale pink and that pale silverish blue, it really looks very nice together. It's not much of a contrast in a good way. They blend nicely. So we're just peppering a few more. As always, I keep 2 or 3 flowers on reserve, and what I mean by that is I place them to the side and I don't use them until I find any bare spots that may be there. That's a good technique that I learned in floral school, is to always keep a few flowers on hand just in case you have any bare spots or any space that could use a little floral product. So now we're going to place one more right where this lamb's ear is. As you can see, it's a little bit bare right there. So we'll take one of these and we'll place it behind. Just like that. So this is how our wreath looks so far, just by incorporating some lamb's ear, some mesh, and a few ranunculus. We used essentially one whole bush. We still have one flower left over. But now what we're going to do, rather than use more expensive foliage, we already have this beautiful foliage. So we're going to break these down into smaller pieces and begin covering some of that pine. This foliage came with the ranunculus, so we might as well take advantage of that. However, if you are purchasing florals and you're planning on using the greenery, just make sure it's of good quality. Often you'll see expensive flowers with very cheap looking foliage, especially in sunflowers and roses. And if that's the case, I'd rather you go out and purchase some nicer greenery than use the less than up to par foliage that sometimes comes with the florals. But this foliage is great, so we're going to use that to our advantage. So we're going to begin adding some of that foliage that came with the ranunculus. So it was a good point in not using the foliage beforehand, because we are ending up with a lot of foliage that we can pepper in and fill in any of the spots that could use it. So to do that, all I did is I broke them down into individual pieces. And we'll begin adding some of them. Whenever I design with evergreen wreaths, if it's not for Christmas, I like to hide the pine as much as possible. It is a Christmas foliage in most cases, so if you can hide it, definitely try. But don't sit there and get frustrated trying to cover every little piece. If you're trying to do that, it's near impossible to cover every little piece. So don't worry too much about tiny bits of pine showing. It'll just accent your wreath. Try to get the bulk of it covered, and if you end up with any pieces that are showing, don't put too much thought into them. So since we're covering the pieces around the front of the sign, we also want to bring some of that foliage up top. Whether it's necessary to cover the pine or not, we do want to tie some of this greenery in by bringing it up to the surface. So just by placing it directly to the mesh, just like that, it lifts the foliage and makes it appear as though it's throughout the entire design. So just take a couple additional pieces, poke them in up top, have them show from the surface. Just like that. So far we've used about 6 or 7 leaves, and we got great coverage so far. Now we're going to do the same thing a little bit lower down. And if you can't see it on camera, the pieces I'm adding around the edges, just keep in mind that whenever you're designing a wreath, you want it beautiful from all points of view. And you want to tie in this foliage to the best of your ability. So here's some pine. All we're doing is just tucking a few of those pieces back and then placing a bit of that greenery right on the surface, just like that. So mesh comes in handy in this case, just because we can use it to kind of prop up some of our florals and some of our foliage. Again, tie it in from the outside. So this is what we have so far. We used some of the extra foliage, and now is the point where we can add anything else we'd like to add. So we're going to add a few more florals. So we do have one final floral I'd like to add today, which is this spray that came from Hobby Lobby, or this bush rather. It was $7.99 from the year-round section, and the item number for this is 1212133, and we're just going to break it down into smaller segments. I'm not too concerned about keeping the foliage. If some pieces have it, that's great. If not, we're not going to save this foliage to use on the rest of the wreath, like the ranunculus foliage. And this is what I'm talking about. Sometimes sprays that are the same price or bushes that are the same price have less than good quality foliage, and this foliage is just awful quality. So if anything, we can bring down some of the foliage and just keep the flowers, but they match perfectly. And also notice that we're keeping in that dainty theme. So we're going to break down some of these and pepper them in. We're going to add a little ribbon later on, and the ribbon we're going to be adding has some white in it, so we do want to showcase that white a little bit more. As well as in the mesh, we do want to show off the mesh a little bit more. So we're just breaking it down into smaller pieces, and we'll pepper them in. As I said before, the more flowers does not necessarily mean the better the wreath. Today's design, the less florals, the better. And we're also having them shoot away from the center of the wreath. So it's not going to take too many. But we do want to make sure we're going to add some around the side. So as you can see, I just placed one on the right-hand side. We'll place one there. And we're not using nearly as many as we did with the ranunculus. But now that we added some florals and some greenery, you truly can see the two different techniques that we applied. Good example is right there. It creates a unique effect by incorporating some curls with your ruffle technique. So we'll just place a couple more. So we'll place one more. And we'll place it up top. Just like that. So now we have all of our florals in place. We're going to be adding some ribbon today. And I guess today is just the day of all new techniques, because the ribbon we're going to be adding is going to be non-traditional. It's not going to be something we've done in the past, but it's a very unique feature that will look perfect in this wreath. So we're going to create several of these bows, which essentially are two ribbons. One's a 1.5 inch ribbon, and the other one is a 2.5 inch ribbon. And what it is simply two bow ties placed right on top of each other. And this creates a very, very cool effect when designing with wreaths like this. So I will place one in just to show you guys the effect you get. And by using this material as well, it kind of softens the edge of the sign, which is exactly what we want. We want our sign to look as though it's incorporated into the wreath. So we're just weaving it through until we get behind the metal frame, and we'll secure it directly to the metal frame. And we can pull back some of the flowers. But this is the effect we get, and it's very, very pretty on a wreath like this. So now we're going to replicate that, and I'm going to show you guys how we do it on my hand. So we're going to create one tail. Let me zoom out a little bit. We're going to create one tail that's approximately 7.5 inches using the 2.5 inch ribbon. We're going to twist it and create our first loop. The loop is going to be about 4.5 inches wide, so about 8 or 9 inches in circumference. And we're going to twist again and create the same exact loop, so that we have a little bow tie, just like that. It doesn't have to be perfect. Everything on this wreath isn't necessarily perfect. And once we place it on, it'll look absolutely stunning. And this one is going to be a little bit smaller. That way it doesn't overpower the first one. So we're going to create our tails about 5.5 to 6 inches. And our loops about 3.5 to 4 inches. So it's a little bit smaller than the first bow. And we're just placing it right on top. We're not cutting anything. We just cut two separate pieces of ribbon. This tail's a little bit longer. Once we add it to the wreath, we can trim it up. But rather than using the pine tips, we are using a pipe cleaner. And we're just using white today. So this ribbon you can pick up from from craftoutlet.com. This one, they have a very similar print at Hobby Lobby, but this was picked up at craftoutlet.com as well. So let me zoom out and show you where we're going to place this. We're going to place it in the upper right-hand corner and kind of create a mirrored image effect. If we would like to place more, we can certainly do so. Let's get these two in place. The most important part with these bows is making sure you're securing it directly to the metal frame. You don't want it to be secured just to the mesh or just to the pine tips. You want to make sure it's secured directly to the metal frame. So since this is such a thick wreath and we have a lot going on, it is a little bit tricky to find the pipe cleaner. There we go. So rather than having it face like this, we're going to do the mirrored image, which means we're going to flip the bow upside down. So if you don't want to use these two ribbons, I recommend purchasing a heavy canvas ribbon or denim ribbon or something that has some substance to it. You want it to be nice and thick so it's sturdy enough to hold itself up, upside down. Both of these ribbons do a great job of that. So if you are using these, They are nice and rigid. So this one, again, a little bit long. So what we're going to do is we're going to trim that down using our scissors. And make sure you have a nice clean cut. We cut both of our ribbons at an angle rather than a dovetail. It creates an interesting effect doing it that way. And there we go. So of course, if you wanted to add one in each corner, you certainly can. I am going to hold off on doing that. I kind of like the asymmetrical vibe, and I kind of like how it's a mirrored image by having one in the upper left-hand corner and one in the lower right. We do have a couple more items we're going to add. They're not going to be flowers, and it's not going to be ribbon. I think you guys are going to find it interesting. So our final element that we're going to add to our wreath are these dark mossy green covered grapevine spheres. We use these in the snowy flocked wreath that we picked up from Walmart a couple months ago, where we added some little mint green colored spheres and all the mint green picks and stuff. So we're going to be using 2 of these. They're slightly different, but that's perfectly fine. If anything, that'll just make our wreath a little bit more unique. So these would also work very nicely with that mossy green ribbon that we used the other day in the bird nest wreath. So to attach these, since they're extremely lightweight and we have such great surface contact with the mesh, we're just going to hot glue them. They are extremely lightweight. Typically what I do is I wire them in place. If you feel more comfortable wiring them in place than applying a generous amount of hot glue, by all means you certainly can do so. And if you are wiring them in, I recommend 22 gauge to 24 gauge. 20 gauge is a little bit thicker. So slightly lighter wire would be better in this case. So we'll just hold it in place for a couple seconds. Again, we have a lot of mesh on this wreath, and it's making great contact with the mesh as well as the evergreen tips that are underneath the mesh. But here's our finished product, you guys. Very simple, very beautiful for spring. Of course, you could use different colors for year-round use. The sign is universal for the entire year. Same with the mesh base. But here's a good tip for you guys. If you have not gotten out there and picked up some evergreen forms, I certainly encourage you to do so. Walmart carries them, Hobby Lobby, Michael's, Joann's, any craft store, Christmas tree shop, AC Moore. They all carry them at this time of year at a reduced price. They're perfect for year-round use, and when you're only spending between $2.50 and $4.50 for a reduced price evergreen form, you can make some good money off of it. So I recommend you guys go out there, purchase some evergreen wreath forms, and think outside of the box. We created a spring wreath, spring and summer wreath using an evergreen form, and you could hardly tell that it was used for Christmas time. All right, everybody, I hope you guys enjoyed that and learned something new, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye, everybody.